Hello, everybody. My name's James Corsi, the Executive Director of the Global Spaceport Alliance, and I want to welcome you to one of our special briefings. And it's a result of the recent congressional budget action that took place on the Hill several weeks ago. And it has specific application to spaceports. It was led by Space Florida, amongst others, and we're going to hear all about that today. But first, let me just quickly go through a couple of updates. I want to thank our 2025 sponsors, RS&H Americ as Platinums, BRPH, Parsons, and ITA as Gold sponsors, and our Silver sponsors, HDR and MITRE. Please make sure that you put on your calendar August 27, because we're going to have a follow-up webinar on spaceports as smart hubs. And I think that's going to be something that'll be very interesting for you to learn more about. We also have several webinars in the works, one on September 10 on academic partnerships, one on October 1st, specifically on ocean launch. And then we're also working on one for commercial spaceport standards. Many of you are already aware, but we are going to be running an International Spaceport Forum on September 28th, the day before the beginning of the International Aeronautical Congress meeting in Sydney, Australia. Our premier sponsor for that is RS&H, and our supporting sponsor is BRPH. But we're also being helped with the American Chamber of Commerce from Australia, AIAA, Spaceport Australia, and High Speed Flight. Also, just a reminder, we have our annual summit meeting on January 27 in Orlando, Florida. If you haven't already registered for this, it's a good time to consider getting ready for it. Our title sponsor for this event is going to be RS&H, and we currently have supporting platinum sponsors Merrick and BRPH, and gold sponsor Parsons. Now, as many of you are aware, the Spaceport Summit kicks off what we call Commercial Space Week. And so it's followed on the 28th by the Space Mobility Conference, which is part of the US Space Force, and then subsequently with SpaceCom. So please make sure to check in and register for the whole week. Keep in mind that as members of GSA, you're eligible for discounts on those registrations. Okay. Now, in some ways, this legislation that we're going to talk about today is potentially one of the most important things that's happened for spaceports in a long time. And we're very fortunate to have one of the key people who were instrumental in its development, Ron Lowell, who's Senior Vice President of Corporate Development and Capital Programs from Space Florida. Now, he's going to go through a pretty detailed presentation with you all, which is going to hopefully generate some questions from you, which I would love you to put into the chat, and I will help moderate those questions and get them to him as time allows. He's going to do approximately a 20-minute presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the conclusion of that. So with all that said, I'd now like to turn it over to Ron. And Ron, take it from here. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, James. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I know talking about things like tax-exempt bonds is not necessarily the most exciting thing, but it actually is very important, I think, in how spaceports are developed over the years and with all the activity that is coming. Thanks, everyone, again, for attending this briefing. Again, my name is Ron Lau. I'm the SVP of Corp Development and Capital Programs for Space Florida. So I head up the business development activities as well as the various capital programs at Space Florida. And I won't go into too much. I mean, I think everyone is familiar from my esteemed colleague Dale Ketchum about Space Florida, what we do, who we are, where the state of Florida's Aerospace Finance and Development Authority, as well as the Spaceport Authority. We came together as a merger of several different organizations back in 2006, and we're organized as a independent special district but we have statewide jurisdiction. And one thing I did want to note is that we are not just space. We are all things aerospace, and actually have this definition in my phone because I haven't had it all memorized. This is something that can only be done by lawyers and legislation. This is all one sentence, but aerospace to us means the technology and industry related to the design, manufacture, maintenance, repair, and operation of aircraft or any other device intended to be used or designed for flight or re-entry, including rockets, missiles, spacecraft, satellites, space vehicles, space stations, space and aircraft facilities or components thereof, and related equipment, systems, facilities, simulators, programs, and activities, including but not limited to the application of aerospace and aviation technology in air-based, land-based, space-based, and sea-based platforms for commercial, civil, and defense purposes. So I'll take a deep breath because that was all one sentence. But I mentioned this mainly because we're in a broader industry. We have been in the financing world of a lot of other projects since we were created in its current iteration in Space Florida since 2006. So a lot of the things that we've seen in other aspects of kind of the aviation and aerospace industries, we saw that, and that really is why we wanted to pursue tax-exempt bonds and private activity bonds more specifically for spaceports. So why is that important? When you look at this from the spaceport perspective, as the issuer, it provides a lower cost of capital for the projects. It attracts private investment, so it doesn't all come from government, and it supports economic growth, where as you see a lot of these projects come along, you really want to start to pull together the entire community there. So again, in the perspective of a spaceport user, and these are for private activity bonds, so these would be the obligor. You get the lower interest rate because it's exempt versus the taxable financing. They're typically more flexible terms in terms of longer term for the financing, for the loan or the bond, and it preserves the liquidity. As we all know, there are a lot of the spaceport users are still in that phase where they are raising equity, raising other capital to further develop their programs and to implement their programs, and to use the equity for long-lived assets isn't the most optimal use of capital. So significant benefits for the spaceport users. And then finally, for the bond investors, they get exempted from their interest income on that. It allows the investors to also diversify their portfolio. A lot of the buyers, in terms of the buying audience there, in terms of the investors, are institutional class investors, to where a lot of for instance, for a lot of the Space Florida financing that are kind of larger debt offerings, it's primarily institutional investors that buy Space Florida debt. So it allows them to diversify between different taxable as well as tax-exempt categories, and it offers them access to a new market. So they're used to investing in more traditional tax-exempt municipal bonds, but this really offers them another aspect of something that is an emerging market, which may offer a different class of returns for these bond investors. So let's roll the time back in terms of when this really first became a topic for making spaceports an exempt category for bond issuance. It goes all the way back to 1991, 102nd Congress. So there was an initial introduction for legislation to make spaceports an exempt category, but it was really a pretty narrowly defined definition. I mean, obviously, it didn't contemplate all the growth with respect to commercial activity at spaceports. So pretty much through 2001, it had been introduced a number of times. But in 2001, there was actually some additional language that was included that aligned it more with commercial, but still didn't have all the flexibility that we currently have in the legislation. Around 2016, this was before my time at Space Florida, there were some efforts to really try to revise the language, generate interest. And probably around 5 years ago was when I really got involved with trying to hone the language and seeing where the industry was going to really make it as applicable as possible. And so the bill was introduced in 2024 and 2025 as a bipartisan, bicameral, multi-state effort. And the U.S. Chamber and a number of others really helped to move this forward. And that was introduced as the Secure Leadership, U.S. Leadership in Space Act. Then finally, it did get passed as an amendment to Section 142 as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill over the summer. And that is the kind of abbreviated history of how we got to where spaceports are now treated like airports under exempt facility bond rules. So it took a long time and it took several iterations of really getting the language right. But I think we've got a good basis from which to really accelerate the growth of some of these projects at spaceports. All right. For those in the audience that have not dealt with tax-exempt facility bonds before, I just want to spend a couple of minutes to talk about what these bonds generally entail in terms of what you can and can't do and some rules around that. So a lot of why we pursued this legislation too was to make spaceports on a level playing field with other transportation utility categories. So when you look at Section 142, there are other exempt categories for tax-exempt bonds. So there are airports, seaports, mass commuting facilities, rail, waste disposal, electric generation facilities, gas generation facilities. So there are a number of other things like with housing and other categories also within 142, but we focus primarily on the transportation utility section. To qualify, there are a couple other rules. So these are primarily for transportation as well. So 95% of the proceeds have to be used for those facilities and projects. So you can have some other expenditures, but for the most part, they have to be directly for those facilities or equipment that is really not portable equipment that is really essential for the operation of that facility. For primarily the transportation related categories, the assets or the facilities have to be owned by a governmental unit. There are some safe harbor rules to where you're allowed to have private users of that facility, and there are a number of different rules for those safe harbor provisions. And that is something that is pretty standard with when you think about airport or seaport bonds there. And also the use of the facility. So there are certain private business uses that are not exempted. So lodging, retail in excess of what is reasonable for that type of facility, office space, industrial parks and manufacturing. Now, again, we modified the language for spaceports, so this is something that we've got something a little bit broader with respect to spaceports versus other transportation categories. Acceptable uses also include storage and training facilities, so that goes pretty much in alignment with most transportation categories. And then I think this is a big thing for a lot of exempt categories. Now, there are a number of transportation categories that don't fall into this. You have to meet allocations under state categories for the state volume cap under Section 146. Luckily, we don't have to deal with that because we did craft the language, so the state volume cap did not apply. Right, let's get into the meat of this. So spaceports are now an exempt category for bonds. So what exactly is the spaceport? Spaceport is any facility at or in close proximity to a launch or reentry site that's used for, and this is important, manufacturing, assembling, repairing spacecraft, space cargo, or other facilities or components of those foregoing facilities, flight control operations, facilities that provide launch services and reentry services, and facilities that are for transferring crew, spaceflight participants, or space cargo to and from aircraft. Now, we crafted this to be pretty broad. The highlighted terms are meanings that are defined in the commercial space launch activities section of the code. But as we'll see in the next slide, we want to make this broader and also more specific to our industry, because what may work for airports or seaports may not necessarily be the same in terms of spaceports with where we are as an industry. So if we dig a little bit deeper into this, and this goes back to being pretty broad, space cargo includes satellites, scientific experiments, other property that's transported into space, and any other type of payload, whether or not such payload or property returns from space. So that gives us a lot of flexibility with respect to when you marry that with the previous definition of the manufacturing, assembling, and repair of all these categories of space cargo. Some other things that we did to make it more applicable for spaceports and then differentiate that from more traditional transportation bonds. So we did want to make it explicit that manufacturing facilities and industrial parks are permitted. It's important to note that for airports, seaports, and some of the other transportation categories, manufacturing and industrial parks were permitted until the 1986 Tax Reform Act. So as airports were starting to get more developed, I mean, they were able to use manufacturing and industrial parks to help spur their development. So we wanted to make sure we had that provision in there. The second thing was we had language in there for presumed public use. There are some Treasury regs that for some of these bonds, transportation bonds, the facilities have to be generally available to the public on a regular basis. And again, we didn't want to have any issues with this and have to be defined in regulations. So we wanted to have specific language to presume that there was public use there to get the first deals going. And like I said, not have to worry about trying to craft regulations of what is and isn't public use. The next two bullets really talk about some things that the original drafters had contemplated, but we just, again, wanted to make sure it was close and close the loop in terms of making sure the federal government's relationship with either the users or with uh, with the spaceport authorities would not disqualify them from using tax-exempt bonds. So this is something that we just, again, just wanted to make sure it was absolutely clear. So whether, because there's so much COD work, there's in cases where the federal government actually owns the land, and so the leasing of that land to a governmental unit could still be considered being owned by that local governmental unit. So there's some things that we made sure that so we can hit the ground running. We wanted to include in the legislation there. So that is just a kind of overview of just how spaceports are defined and the types of use that are permitted without going into a whole lot of detail on other specifics with respect to tax-exempt bonds. So I want to touch upon this conduit debt structure. So a lot of these private activity bonds utilize what's known as a conduit structure. So it's essentially a pass-through to where there are three parties involved. So there's the issuer, which in this case would be the Spaceport Authority, and that would also own that asset. Now, in some cases, there might be a separate industrial development authority that may actually be the issuer, but there needs to be that local government ownership of the asset. So they issue the bonds for the benefit of the private user, and that would be what's known as the obligor, and sometimes they're also termed the borrower, but that would be the spaceport user, and they would be the one that is the party that pays the debt, and then the debt service to the bondholder. So those are the three parties that are involved in the conduit deal. With respect to conduit structures, it's a non-recourse transaction. So this is where, I mean, with respect to the actual financing terms, it's going to be based on the creditworthiness of the project because it's not being backed by the full faith of the state or the authority, because it is non-recourse. It's going to be very specific to the project. Now, depending on what all this looks like, there may need to be some other credit enhancements, equity sponsors, things that are pretty normal in the industry anyway. But again, there are still a lot of other benefits that outweigh any kind of complexity that that some parties may have of doing a tax-exempt financing. There's typically 100 to 225 basis points between the same deal being taxable versus tax-exempt, and the yields actually may be even greater when you think about bond purchasers that are the highest marginal income bracket. So one story I like to bring up is with LaGuardia Airport when they were doing I don't know, it was they sold $875 million of tax-exempt bonds for a Delta terminal, and for a New York purchaser, I think the effective yield, if that was a taxable bond, would have been close to 11% annual return. So that could be very significant in terms of the attractiveness of tax-exempt bonds, particularly on things that may be, I'd call it, more aligned to corporate returns versus like a wastewater facility treatment or something that may be a little bit less dynamic there. Other things that we're seeing in terms of trends or a lot of the deals, before the project gets financed, it would require a GMP or guaranteed maximum price from a contractor, depending on the company. It may require a corporate guarantee if you're dealing with subsidiaries that roll up to a parent. So there are other things that are going to be considerations as the deal gets put together. And as I mentioned before, there's some complexity with a tax-exempt deal. You need to make sure you have the right professionals involved. So a financial advisor for the authority. You've got your bankers that are selling the bonds. You have separate bond and tax counsel. You want to make sure if you're not actually doing the issuance yourself, that you have a competent issuer there, and make sure you have the internal resources to see this through. And one of the things that we have seen, and this was a non-industry tax-exempt deal, but there was one deal that there wasn't enough diligence, in my opinion, that was done, and that deal actually went bankrupt in 18 months after raising $250 million. It might have been a little bit more than that, but there was actually a story about it in the Wall Street Journal last month. And when that deal came out, I mean, every investment banker that deals in the municipal market knows this deal, and it's just a case study and just a story of how we try to just make sure we do our diligence. So, how real are projects? Just looking at some of the projects we have in the Cape, when you look at the rules, it could be uh, financed if the legislation was there. So you just go through the definitions. Is the facility at or in close proximity of a launch and reentry site? All of these, yes. Use the facility. So whether it's satellite manufacturing, payload processing, um, those all kind of check the box. And also, if it's leased to a private entity, is there government ownership for the safe harbors to make sure that they would qualify for exempt? And all of these would have checked yes. When we look at kind of the broader aspects of other projects that may be applicable to you, operating and developing spaceports. Obviously, we talked about satellite manufacturing and payload processing, but other common use infrastructure in terms of runway or taxiway extensions. We've seen a lot of demand in terms of testing facilities, and obviously for just regular launch and reentry infrastructure, other GSC. I mean, those would also all be applicable for tax-exempt financing as well.
Ron, it's
Yes,
James.
sir.
Just quickly, we got a question about whether or not this could be used for space stations or the development of a space station.
So at this point, I guess at this point, the definitions are tied to those commercial space activity definitions. So those definitions are more terrestrially bound. I would
Okay.
anticipate that would be one of the aspects of things that we would talk to Treasury about, is to say, well, I mean, it may start terrestrially, but eventually go up, and I think there could be an argument to be made of whether or not the regs should encompass that within the purview of exempt bonds. So if it's not now, it's certainly something that we would want to pursue and perhaps modify if it's not clear that it's something that we can address through the regulations.
Okay. We just got another question here. And John, I hope I don't mess this up, but his question is this: if I understand correctly, this form of tax-exempt bond applies only to spaceports operating on public land, for example, via a lease. Are the examples of tax-exempt bonds for purely private infrastructure, air, seaports, or purely private spaceports?
It would have to have government ownership. As with the with airports and seaports that are utilizing tax-exempt bonds, then yes, it would have to be that. So purely private would not qualify just because of the way it's also been for other modes of transportation.
Okay.
Now, effectively, these long-term leases. So, I mean, again, it's been common for decades. So, like I said, I mean, airlines with the long-term leases of terminals that are really owned by the Port Authority. Uh, the same for ports or seaports. So it's something that is fairly known in the industry. So both from the investor standpoint as well as the bankers.
Sure. We have another question from Kevin from All Points. Can you further explain the requirement for government ownership of projects that will be leased to a private entity? Majority investors in some highly capitalized projects require ownership of the main asset.
Yes, and this kind of is where some of Space Forward's experience with other transactions come into play, because for many of those type of structures, Space Forward does own the asset, and we do get that financed through third-party financing. So effectively, the long-term lease is structured in such a way that the at least the debt holders are comfortable with the the securitization and collateralization of that asset. So the ownership and the lease structure, again, because it's been done in other modes of transportation for so long, they are comfortable with that.
Okay.
But I think related to that question is how how do public-private partnerships also uh, can help with getting these deals done? I know with Florida, I mean, there are local, regional, state level tools that can be a value add in being a credit enhancement or really helping shape the deal to make it a financeable deal. So I think those deals would make it a workable deal better to get some better terms. But I'll get to this in just a second, but it's not going to make a bad deal financeable. Uh,
Right.
the, the market reception, as I've mentioned, we've been priming the market for several years. We had lots of positive responses from finance institutions as well as other inbound company inquiries around how we can structure something and partner. The last 3 years, I've presented at JP Morgan's Transportation and Utility Institutional Investor Conference, and uh, all the big municipal bond buyers were there. So they've been hearing this from me for a number of years. So actually seeing it come to fruition, it's good. I mean, so yeah, we've gotten a lot of good interest. I'll give props to our comms team for some of these kind of retro looking posters as we start to market how some of these projects can get financed in the future using tax-exempt bonds. I think, how can spaceports really be in the best position to attract projects? Lesson learned from our side. I mean, you want to make sure you can ensure that the sites are as ready for development as reasonably uh, can be done. I don't think you want to be too far ahead of your skis, but you do want to make sure that that you meet these companies at the right point to be able to act quickly. And again, just really doing the due diligence that you need to get things so it is a financeable deal. And I'll be glad to share later with everyone the deal that was in the Wall Street Journal that went bankrupt in 18 months, but you definitely do not want that on your spaceport. And like I said, this was not an industry related deal.
Mhm.
So with that, I will leave it for other questions. I know, James, we've had a few already.
Yeah. I mean, just broadly speaking, Ron, and this is a toughie, I guess, but we are the Global Spaceport Alliance. So for members that are outside the US, do you see sort of a bit of a template here that they might be able to use within their own countries to help with this kind of process?
Yeah, I think, James, I think for some of the other members outside of the U.S., there's certainly the financing mechanisms are there, but I think the main theme here is pulling together tools that make these projects much more capital efficient. So I think the lower interest rates help the public-private partnerships and how you build that capital stack of making sure that everyone's needs are met to be able to finance it. I think that certainly can be used as a template using whatever tools are available in the country, and it may be again a combination of various uh, state or national uh, practices or tools that may be available, and then being able to partner with other organizations that can uh, can really effectively reduce the cost of capital and really the way that I've normally have kind of gone through it is you want to use the right type of capital for the right type of application. So, as I
Hmm.
said, for long-lived assets, long-term financing is a much better, much more capital efficient way of financing that. And then for development and work capital, you use equity. And so I think that really is the template for how you build the right capital stack. And there are ways that you can make sure that all the risk reward profiles are aligned.
Yeah. We have another question here came in from Spaceport America, Sal. Um, is there a rule of thumb threshold for the source of the tax base, i.e., how many taxpayers per the cost of project to gauge if there is enough of a market for potential investors?
And that would be an answer for the bankers. But so again, for a lot of the projects that are out there, the muni market buyer buying municipal bonds, which would be these would be those type of bonds with respect to tax exempt, there is quite the appetite for for purchasing tax-exempt bonds. And as I mentioned earlier, seeing a new category come up that is different allows them to diversify their portfolio. So I think it's less of the individual buyers of bonds, but it's more these larger institutions that purchase those bonds.
Okay. All right. But just broadly, an incredibly unfair question, but what do you see as coming next? What's the next big thing that will happen
With
or could
respect
happen?
to the tax exempt bonds or with
Or
respect
with
to,
respect to legislation that would positively impact spaceports?
um, I think there are still so many things there, but I mean, I'll stick to what I know, which is uh, on the financing side of things, because I think the capital really helps drive the development of those capabilities. So I think as we start to refine the edges of the legislation, there's some of the edge cases with respect to where things are. And I think, James, one of the other questions of doing things that are are non-terrestrial. I mean, I think as we
Right.
start to get to that point, that will certainly accelerate the capitalization and development of those capabilities. But I
Okay.
mean, that'll be the focus, at least for us, is really defining some of those. In terms of the other kind of bigger policy issues, I mean, I would have to defer to some of my other colleagues.
Sure.
Even though I'm a lawyer, I'm not a space lawyer.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, Ron. Well, listen, we're sort of right up to the end of our time here. So I want to thank you very, very much for a very exciting and interesting presentation. For all of you, we'll have a tape of this available to you within a week to 10 days. And it's very, very exciting stuff. And thank you, Space Florida and Ron Lau, for pushing this forward so strongly. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, James, and thanks for the whole GSA membership and team for allowing me this opportunity. And look forward to seeing everyone starting to get some deals done here.
Absolutely. We might have to start putting them in the newsletter to make everybody realize how many there could be.
Exactly.
All right, all.
Thanks
Thank you
very
very much. Appreciate your time today.
Right. So on. Bye.
Okay.